Not many people think about the funeral process, let alone our own. So it may come as a shock that the average person is actually supposed to start thinking about the funeral process, their final wishes, and end-of-life decisions around the age of 18. That's right now. That's college years. Today I'm going to be discussing the unique elements of the funeralization process, as well as how the funeral process can help with our own death anxiety, and how funeralization process is important for our survivors. Not many people realize that instead of the traditional burial path that they can take that involves a cemetery or a cremation, there's other things out there that are called life-centered funerals, and they focus on a person's life more so than the person's death. And it's a very unique process, and it's something to put a lot of thought into, and they just started in the 1990s, but they're growing in popularity. The first kind of burial I'm going to be talking about today is the green burial. It's also called an eco-burial. The point of this is so that everything incorporated into the funeral is biodegradable, including the coffin and, the tombstone. Everything must be biodegradable. The cemetery, if you will, or the place of burial is a field, or it can be in the woods. It's a very natural setting. No tombstones, there's no vaults around the coffins, no copper, steel, or polished wood caskets are allowed in the cemetery. A simple tree, rock, or a wood plaque can hold as the tombstone or a marker, and the body cannot be embalmed. There's no chemical processes allowed to happen to the body before burial. As to finding the body, the cemetery usually allows a GPS device to be buried with the body so that family members can go and visit and have an accurate marking as to where their loved one is, because again, there's no tombstone made out of, real stone in the cemetery. It's only a tree or another type of plant or a wood plaque, and those, it's pretty hard to find when they're in the woods or in an open field with other trees and plants, so it's very unique. They're called sustainable cemeteries because there's no maintenance to them. There's nothing that really needs to occur. It's just to let nature take its course. Another form of burial I'm going to be talking about is an ocean burial. Now, it's not the burial at sea that most of us would think about when we think of an ocean burial. It's called a reef burial, and it's also referred to as an internal reef. And this is where cremated remains are integrated into a constructed reef, and a burial service takes place. And the constructed reef is then lowered into the ocean, and it becomes a habitat for the life down there. So it's another form of an eco-burial, but it's a little different. It incorporates the ocean as a final resting place, which some of us would think is a little depressing, but this one's really, really unique, and probably no one has ever even heard of it. A space burial is truly a life-centered burial. A space burial is where cremated remains are lowered into a rocket and then launched into space. Now, it's not, NASA's rocket. It's a tinier rocket, of course. But the cremated remains are then shot into space, and then they orbit around Earth for a few weeks before entering back into the Earth's atmosphere and then being totally incinerated. Another more expensive form of space burial is when the cremated remains are loaded onto the rocket but then shot with enough momentum to actually make it to the moon, or perhaps steer clear of the moon and just continue into space, and then instead of being incinerated, space is actually the final resting place for the cremated remains. Most people have death anxiety. Now, the severity of people's death anxiety is of course at different levels, but in American society, death is looked at as a taboo, as it happens and it's there, but let's not talk about it because it's morbid and it's just not part of life. It's the end of life. It's something abstract and something that we as humans don't truly understand. I mean, we have people who look at it from a religious standpoint, but there's always questions as to if there's any historical fact to religion, and it's just something that really freaks people out. People have it to the point where they won't even go outside. They won't do things because they're so afraid that they're going to die. And this stems from childhood and the way that we were raised and the way that we have seen death our entire lives. But there are ways in minimizing death anxiety. One of the most common things that a person can do in order to help minimize death anxiety is to just simply write a will. Now, a will is a documentation of your estate and your belongings and what's going to happen to them after you pass away. Now, this allows a person to have their estate and belongings sufficiently put in order by them. Not after you die, when they get split up. This is you doing it for yourself. It makes you realize that you're not going to be around forever, and these things aren't going to be yours forever. And it puts less burden on the survivors after you pass away. One of the very unique ways that we can take our death anxiety, by the neck and stare it in the face is by pre-planning. Now, in a sense, pre-planning is when you're planning a party that you're just not going to be able to attend, but this party is all about you. You meet with the funeral director inside a funeral home, and there you get to be in the atmosphere of a funeral home that we all know is a little different, than meeting in a regular corporate building. It's got a different feel to it. Now, while you're there, you get to pick your form of body disposal. This means cremation or regular cemetery burial, medical science, or perhaps one of the forms of burial that we discussed earlier in the presentation, such as eco-burial. Now, while you're there, you can come to terms with what will happen with your body. You get to figure out if you want embalming, open casket, closed casket, or really if you want any service at all, because the funeral home is able to just take your body straight from place of death to straight to the crematory. No funeral needs to take place, but pre-planning is essentially very important in society. It's a good way to get a hold of your death anxiety. You can plan every detail in the funeral process. You can pick your decor, what you want to wear in the coffin, if it's open casket. You get to pick the music that you want to be played, what kind of food you want to have present, what you want other people to wear, if you want them to wear bright colors instead of the traditional just black and depressing clothing. It's very unique, and you should really think about doing it. End-of-life decision-making is extremely important because it's a way that we come to terms with what if. What if I'm in a car accident and I'm put into a coma and I'm in a hospital and I'm on a breathing tube and a nutrition tube, and what if? What if I don't wake up for 3 months? Do I really want to continue to go on for years and years and years on this machinery, not truly being me, but just being able to live through artificial, breathing and nutrition? So it's very important to have this established, and you can have this established through an advance directive, which is a written document that establishes what you want, rather than leaving it up to family, because most of the time when family comes to the conclusion that you are in a coma and in a hospital and there's no real evidence that you'll ever come out, they want to keep you on that artificial breathing and artificial nutrition so that they can have you there. You're not dead yet. So it's very important to establish if you want that feeding tube, if you want that breathing tube, or if you just want to let nature take its course. Now we're going to discuss closure for our loved ones from the funeralization process. After we're gone, family members mourn, and it's very important to have established certain things so that mourning can properly take place, and that happens through services. Services allow us to properly mourn. We can't just hear about somebody's death who's close to us and then not acknowledge it and go on living. We need some form of a service so that we can properly mourn. The first kind of service I'm going to talk about is a memorial service. And in this service, the deceased is absent. The body is not present. Usually there's just pictures, food, music. It's a celebration of the person's life. And this can be held at a religious establishment for a religious feel, or it can be held at a home of a family member for a more comfort, relaxed setting, or it can be held at a funeral home for a more professional feel. It allows for proper mourning. It just doesn't have the body present. Open casket wakes allow for family and friends to physically see the body, and it's also termed as the most effective form of closure. It allows for people to come to the realization that a person is deceased. It is also an effective way for children, as sometimes they may think that the deceased person is gone, but they'll return, as in, Grandpa's just sleeping, he's going to wake up. Or Aunt Beth's just on vacation, she'll be back next week. It allows for people to express feelings towards the deceased as well. People like to talk with the deceased. You'll often hear people next to the deceased member of the family having a conversation, saying that they're sorry, or they love them, or they miss them. Sometimes people need to touch the body to realize that there's going to be no response, and it's kind of that last bit of connection to them, that last physical touch that they will ever be allowed to have with the deceased member again. It's very important that the body is present at these services, because it's the ultimate form of closure. To see that person as not living anymore, they're dead. The last form of service that I'm going to talk about as closure for family members is the burial service. Burials allow for survivors to accompany their loved one to their final resting place. It's the last physical act that they may share with other bereaved members and the deceased in the same setting. It's another form of closure, and probably the harshest, because it becomes evident that the deceased will never be seen in physical form again. Most people leave after the service is performed at the burial site, while the casket is still above ground, but the more intimate circle of bereaved will sometimes stay and witness the actual burial. Services at a crematory can also provide this service, as the intimate group of bereaved can go in and witness the casket being rolled into the crematory. But a funeral allows for the actual last act of saying goodbye while the body is present. And it also gives comfort, because the bereaved members like the fact that they can go and visit. Although it's not the deceased anymore, it's just an area. You're going to be with them in the cemetery. It's another form of closure separate from the actual burial, because you get to be with them. You get to go back on special occasions like anniversaries and birthdays and be with the deceased. So now that we've discussed the funeralization process in the sense of unique burials and death anxiety and how pre-planning can help and closure to our families, I hope I really got the gears turning inside your head to consider some of this stuff. I'm not saying consider all of it. I'm not saying if you're 23 years old you need to go pre-plan your own funeral, but it's good to have these things thought out, like your end-of-life decisions, because that can happen at any moment. Let somebody know if you want to be buried or cremated. Get your things in order. It's very, very important, because death is a taboo in American society. We don't like to think about it, but it's essential, because death is a part of life, and it happens to everybody. Thank you for your time.